Today, we will be talking to Korean film expert Darcy Paquette, a film critic, translator, and actor who has lived in Korea for over 2 decades. Darcy did the English subtitles for director Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, which won Best Picture at the Academy Awards last year. His relationship with director Bong goes back 20 years to when Darcy collaborated with him on his very first film and has been translating all of Bong Joon-ho's films ever since, with the exception of Okja on Netflix. Darcy also takes on acting as a side job and has participated in numerous Korean films. One of them is The Taste of Money, where he acted with Yeo Jung-yoon, who won the Best Supporting Actress Award at the Academy this year for her performance on Minari. With Darcy, we will be talking about why Korean films are popular these days, what makes them unique, as well as his experiences in acting in Korea, and working with famous directors on translating their films.
I'm Darcy Paquette. I've been living in Korea since 1997 and have been doing various work in the film industry, including translating and teaching and working with film festivals. I was actually quite lucky to be able to work with director Bong Joon-ho at the beginning of his career. At the time, I was working part-time for the Korean Film Council, and I had a website that was I was writing about Korean cinema and working as a journalist as well. But I heard that this new director needed some help with his subtitles, that he wanted to just sit down with someone and go over the subtitles and kind of discuss possible changes to be made. And so this was for his first film, which is called Barking Dogs Never Bite. It was in the year 2000. And I'd seen the film in the theater and liked the film, and it's really a hilarious film. And so I remember most of all just sitting together with him and laughing constantly as we were watching the film together. And we were trying to come up with different ways to get the humor to come across to a foreign audience. And then I was quite surprised because a few years later, he was preparing his second movie, Memories of Murder, and I had heard a lot about the film already because the screenplay had become kind of famous among people in the industry. Everybody had high expectations for this work. And he called me when the film was in post-production, and he asked me to do the subtitle translation. And up until this point, I had done proofreading of subtitles before. My Korean wasn't up to the level of doing a full translation myself at that time, but my wife is Korean, and so the two of us did it together. And so this was my first experience, kind of doing a full subtitle translation. And from that time on, I've been working with him for, most of his films, with the exception of Okja. I've worked together with him on all of his films. I think it was somebody at the Korean Film Council who recommended me. I don't know exactly, but also I think he told me that he had read my review of his film. So yeah, it was a very long time ago, so I don't remember the details, but at that point I had started kind of writing about Korean cinema, and there was very little information in English about Korean cinema at that time. And I was lucky, I guess, to come into Korea at the beginning of this period of growth. So I was able to watch it happen and be one of the first people to write about it in detail. For translating, obviously, Parasite was the one that really kind of changed a lot for me. I think the actual process of working on it was similar to what it had been working with Bong Joon-ho in the past. It was a film that had a lot of challenging expressions to translate, and we required a lot of thought and effort. And yet it was kind of an intense period of work, and then we finished. There are a lot of other films where in the process of translating it becomes much a longer, more involved experience because the director might be kind of re-editing the film later and then making a new version of it, or changing different aspects of the dialogue. Bong Joon-ho, I think one thing that's impressive about him is that he, I think, has a clear vision of what kind of film it's going to be even before he starts to shoot it. And then when he's editing, he finishes the edit and then it's done. He doesn't tinker with the film later. I think he knows what he wants and then he makes it and then it's done. So it's always impressive to see him at work and to talk to him about the subtitles. There were a mix of things. I mean, some things I think are challenging in every film because the Korean language is very good at expressing relationships between people, just in terms of the register of speech that you're using. And then directors can kind of subtly change that in a way that shows how their relationship is changing. Before I started working on the film, I got like 4 pages of notes from the director who had thought through all different aspects of it. But one thing he did which helped me a lot was to describe the relationships between certain characters. And so I could keep that in mind as I was translating. And then there are a lot of difficult individual words or situations to translate. I mean, one example was a scene where one character starts kind of speaking in the same intonation and accent as North Korean news anchors. The audience in Korea will pick up on that immediately just from hearing her voice and the way that she's speaking. And she is talking about North Korean nukes and everything else, but the fact that she is imitating a news anchor is not clear in the dialogue itself. And so we had to kind of adjust the dialogue when her husband responds to her. Like we wrote it as, nobody can imitate North Korean news anchors like you, or something that inserted a bit of explanation into the translation. Yeah, and then there were just things like, ramdon, the chapaguri. It's a made-up word in Korean, taking 2 different instant noodle brands and sticking them together to make a new word. And I wasn't sure how to approach that in the Korean. The director told me he didn't want to simply, spell out chapaguri in the English because he thought that the audience, they wouldn't be able to relate to it in any way. And so I decided to take 2 noodles that most people would recognize, like ramen and udon, and stick them together to make a new word. There are a lot of situations in translating where there's no perfect solution, and you just need to make a choice between several bad options. So that's what I did, but I never expected it to become such a catchword, and with people people making the dish themselves. And I remember Googling ramdon as I was doing the translation, just wondering if it had some other meaning that I wasn't aware of. And a Google search turned up almost nothing, but these days if you type in ramdon to Google, you get millions of pages come up. So it's been a weird experience. Well, the Jessica song was easier than it may seem at first, because it's partly just about the rhythm, but that's one big difference between translating novels and translating film, is that when you're translating film, the audience can hear the actor's voice, and there's a certain rhythm to it, and there's a lot of emotion that's kind of expressed to the audience. And if you look at that scene, actually you get almost everything you need from like the rhythm of it and her movements and the sing-song style of her voice. And so in that case I could use a fairly direct translation and it worked just as well.
아 잠깐. 제시카 외동딸 유리노 이시카 고가성방은 김진모 그놈 이사촌.
I tried to. My Korean's not perfect. I've been studying it for over 20 years, and my wife is Korean, and so I speak Korean at home, but I always have people check my translations in case there's something that I missed in the original, like some nuance that I wasn't aware of. Yeah, and so I remember in the case of Parasite, I did the first draft myself, but then several other people looked at it. At the end, we had a big meeting at the distributor with the director and the producer and I think 4 people from CJ, the distributor, and me, and we watched through the film and kind of stopped line by line and discussed the translation of each term. I don't often get to see the end result, but most rewarding is if I can go to a film festival and I can sit in the middle of an audience of people from many different countries, and then I can watch the film with my subtitles. When the audience laughs at the humor in the film, then that's a really satisfying experience because it felt like I was able to transmit that. And so that's kind of the most rewarding time. I've always thought of myself mostly as a writer, and yet I find myself in a situation where these days I'm getting more and more work in other fields, and so I'm doing more teaching and more translating. Acting I do still consider kind of a really fun side job, but not kind of my main focus. The way I started acting was basically just the fact that I got to know a lot of directors while living in Korea. And the very first time, there was a director who had asked me to help him find an actor for this role that had to be shot very quickly because they were going to shoot it during a particular film festival. And it was a role that nobody really wanted to take. And so I ended up taking it myself. And so it slowly kind of built from that point on. These days there are quite a lot of kind of international actors working within Korea. People from many different countries, and all of them have agents, and they're part of management companies, and that whole system has become very developed. And actually, I don't have an agent at all, but because through my work I've been able to get to know a lot of directors personally, and occasionally these opportunities come up. But I don't really think of myself as a professional actor. I can't quite bring myself to turn down the opportunity when it comes up. I have no direct experience, either watching or taking part in filmmaking in the States. But from what I've kind of picked up in talking to different people, I'm told that there is a strong sense of camaraderie on the set of Korean films. Crews, the film crews in Korea are both really well trained and hardworking, and they come together quite well and work quite hard. That's one of the reasons that Korean cinema is able to kind of maintain this high level of technical quality in all their works. There's a lot of respect given to the director. In some ways, Korea has been influenced by the French model of the director as an auteur. And yet at the same time, Korea, in an industry sense, embraced more of a Hollywood model. And so what you have now is kind of a combination of the two. Well, actually, the labor practices in Korea have changed in recent years. And that's been another thing that's been interesting to watch. Because it certainly used to be the case that you were expected to just keep shooting until something was done, even if it takes twice as long as you were expected to. And I've heard from other actors, stories about going to a set and staying there for like 40 hours. Sometimes not even acting, just waiting for the chance to start their scene and then being told to go home. But there, around 10 years ago, there was a kind of the first union of film workers that came together, and they've been pushing producers to kind of make some standards for working hours. And there was a broad agreement that the industry came to few years ago, and so now you can shoot for 16 hours straight, and then you take 8 hours off, and then you can start the next day on another 16-hour stretch. And so there are some rules now, whereas in the past there were none. Yeah, I mean, acting was something that I did a little bit growing up and taking part in community theater productions, and I did direct a play when I was a university student. So I had thought about acting before and kind of had some basic knowledge about how to approach it. But film acting is very different from theater acting, because theater acting, kind of your gestures are bigger and you're projecting your voice more, whereas film acting is much more intimate, where the camera is closer to you, and very kind of subtle changes in your face are expressed much more than you might think they would be. I like how when you're shooting films, you can shoot a scene and then go and then watch your performance on the monitor, and then go back and then fix the things that look awkward. I guess about half and half in terms of English and Korean. The roles, I mean, I will say that they've been diverse in one sense, in that sometimes I'm playing these very rich, like kind of investment bankers or like princes of capitalism, something that I'm not very familiar with in my ordinary life. But I think in most cases my characters represent some kind of idea, and so I can either be a symbol for American economic power in that example, or I've played priests a number of times. But in most cases, my goal, I guess, it would be really interesting playing a role that was originally written for a Korean and Vic just decided to give it to me, because I think then I think you would have kind of a more developed character. But most of the roles I play are supporting roles, or kind of off to the side. I was already a big fan of hers at the time that we worked together in that film. There were quite a number of scenes that we appeared together in it.
Hi, Robert.
오면서 저 TV 봤습니다. 어떻게 된 겁니까?
Don't worry. Everything is under my control.
Let me just say one thing. If Chul is prosecuted for any reason, the deal is over, nullified. 무효예요.
It has nothing to do with our deal. No, nothing.
I was really impressed by her. I think that, I've come across some actors who on screen project this tremendous energy, but then off the screen don't have that same kind of energy. It's something that comes to them as they're performing. I think what probably anybody who's ever acted with Yoo Jung will tell you is that all that energy that she has is part of her either on or off the camera. And you saw that just kind of in the interviews that she gave, acceptance speeches at the Oscars. She's very professional. She doesn't like things to kind of fall behind schedule, and she puts everything into her acting. It was a thrill to work with her, and I developed even more respect for her in the course of making that film. My original plan was to stay for 2 years, and my long-term plan was to go to the Czech Republic, because I had majored in Russian and had studied a little bit of Czech in the US. I was interested in languages, and so I originally came to Korea as an English teacher, but it was because I had a lot of Korean friends in the US that I ultimately decided on Korea, and that I wanted to spend some time in Asia before going to Eastern Europe. As it turns out, I never made it to the Czech Republic, even for a visit. I'm still here 24 years later. I was really interested in Asian cinema before coming to Korea. I did see 2 Korean films in the US before my first time arriving in Korea, but it was primarily after I arrived that I decided to use film as one way to help learn the language and to learn a bit more about the culture. And it was originally film was my hobby, not my profession. But it was when I started watching Korean films and realizing that there were a lot of really interesting young Korean directors at that time, and that nobody was writing about them in English on the internet, that I decided at first just to make a website introducing Korean films. And it was the website that led directly to a job offer to work as a journalist at a film trade magazine called Screen International, based in London. And so that, it was 4 years after I came to Korea that I kind of shifted from being an English teacher to being a film journalist and doing other work related to film. I mean, I have felt from the beginning that there's something about Korean cinema that feels different if you compare it to Hollywood or other, films from Asia. And it's been really hard to kind of put my finger on exactly what it is that's different. But I think that one of the things that's related to it is the way that emotions are kind of, transmitted to the viewer in Korean cinema. I think it's done in a very direct way, whereas in the US, I think the emotions tend not to be so direct. They can be, there's a lot of irony that's used in Hollywood films and storytelling, or even if it's not outright irony, things kind of are a bit slanted in the way that they're presented to the audience. Whereas the emotions in Korean films are so direct, it does make for a kind of storytelling that feels somewhat different. Sometimes this is perhaps a strength and sometimes a weakness. There's a lot of spectacle within Hollywood cinema, which are these moments within the film when the story kind of slows down, and then we have this visual spectacle or something that's meant to kind of overwhelm us through special effects or whatever. And in Korea, it tends to be these moments of kind of intense emotion that function in a similar way as spectacle does in Hollywood cinema. And so the story kind of slows down, but the emotion kind of washes over the audience. And this is true of both Korean TV dramas and also cinema, even if the style is different between the two industries. But because of that, because of the way it fits within the storytelling, I think that people watching Korean films for the first time, they sense that something is different, even if they can't quite put their finger on it. I think Korean film has a lot of energy as well, just because it's a function of the fact that Korea is a dynamic place that is developing very quickly and a lot is happening. I don't think it's not a coincidence that Korean cinema's development and then its huge success came at the same time that Korea was transitioning both its political system, but also, in many ways, Korea is a place that changes quite quickly. We see big differences between the generations in Korea. I think much greater than you get in Europe or in North America. Living in Seoul, if I go away for 2 weeks and I come back, then one store has disappeared and the other building has gone up, and the landscape of Seoul is constantly changing. And I think, to a certain extent, Korean cinema absorbs the culture's dynamism, and it's another thing that gives Korean cinema a bit of its energy. I think there are a couple of factors behind it, and part of it has just been that I think changing people's viewing attitudes is sort of like trying to move a tanker, and that it happens very slowly. But what we're seeing now is in some ways a culmination of something that's been happening for 20 years. I do think that Netflix and other OTT services have played a big part in that, because it becomes easier for films from other countries to really reach a worldwide audience at once. The standard distribution model for international film is quite slow, and it's divided up into different markets, and then films are sold to each market individually. But because of this, it takes a long time for films to kind of spread abroad, and sometimes they can find success, but there's something very immediate about a film dropping on Netflix and becoming available to viewers all around the world at the same moment. It creates a kind of momentum, I think, for films, and so that's helped. I think it's also connected with kind of broader changes within Korean pop culture, so that the success of BTS might make it more likely that someone would take a chance on a Korean movie. I mean, certainly if you're a BTS fan, I think that then that opens you up to Korean culture. But even if you're not, there's a sense, I think, these days that Korea is a place that's producing interesting cultural content. Viewers may be more willing to take a chance on it, and then once they do, if they like what they've seen, then there's perhaps a snowball effect after that. With Parasite, I mean, my feeling is it was a whole bunch of things that came together at once. I mean, certainly, I think we have to give the most credit to director Bong because he's a genius and he made an amazing film. And not only him, but there was a lot of talent behind that film, and it's extremely well crafted. So it leaves a big impression on viewers. I do think that the themes that it told were very relevant to the present day, not only in Korea but all around the world, because it's talking about inequality and it's talking about capitalism, basically. And in terms of the Academy Awards specifically, there does seem to be an effect with the expansion of kind of the voting block, because, I mean, 6 or 7 years ago, it was still much more of a limited range of people who were taking part in the voting, dominated by particularly older white men, whereas the voting bloc has become much more international in recent years. And looking at the films that have won Best Picture in the past 5 or 6 years, I think they are somewhat more adventurous, perhaps, than they were in the past. So, 10 years ago, it may have been difficult, I think, for Parasite to win Best Oscar, but the Academy itself is changing. Minari is a really interesting example because it's in one sense an extremely American film. I was really kind of impressed to read an interview by the director when he cited Willa Cather in her novel My Antonia as one of the big inspirations for that, because that's a book that I'd read growing up and which also seems to really capture something essentially American for me. And yet, a lot of the details in the film are very specifically Korean, and of course a lot of it's in Korean language. In the Korean language and cultural details and many things that Koreans will recognize, both if they've grown up in Korea, but especially if they've come from Korea to the US. It managed to tell a very specific story in a very universal way. I mean, this is a film that, because it can really relate to people from many different backgrounds and their experiences in the US, that in my mind I kind of put it in a slightly different category than Parasite, even though both films were, we see Korean actors in the Korean language, but to me, Minari's success was really exciting, but not quite as surprising to me, I guess, as Parasite. Just because it did feel like a very American project to me. So I could easily understand why the voters were so moved by the story. I think one reason that people were particularly critical of the Golden Globes was because they, by labeling Minari as a foreign film, or it disqualified it from the main categories. And yet, if we look back a few years to Quentin Tarantino's *Inglourious Basterds*, this was also a film that was less than 50% in English, and yet that film qualified for all of the categories that Minari did not. So in that sense, the Golden Globes were not being consistent. It opened them up to criticism of being a bit not open-minded enough or not consistent enough in their approach. I mean, it's been fascinating for me personally just to witness this, because when I first arrived in Korea, Korea had a very weak film industry, and it was, I don't want to put it down by saying, but it was very underdeveloped compared to the present day. And there was a really strong push on the part of particularly young producers at that time to create a more efficient and a better streamlined system for making films. And that has happened over the past 20 years. So, I mean, from an industry perspective, you do see a big difference between today's cinema and the way that it's made compared to, say, in the early 2000s. And actually, there are good and bad points to that. I think that the system is now extremely well developed, and you don't see films being made of low quality. There's kind of a floor that Korean films don't go under because the system is well developed enough so that you can guarantee at least a certain basic level of quality. I think the big challenge for the film industry has been to maintain creativity as the system has become more structured and streamlined. And I think there's a natural tendency when you've continued to be successful at the box office, and the Korean film industry has been remarkably profitable over the years compared to other film industries. But at the same time, I think it's becoming less averse to risk. Whereas at the time when Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook and these other directors were really starting their careers and making their first breakthroughs, in a way there was more creative freedom at that time. And there was a sense that Korean cinema needed to try something new in order to reach a broader audience. And producers were willing to take risks or to try things that they had never tried before. And the end result was a series of really highly original films, some of which were very successful, others of which failed spectacularly, but that helped the film industry to grow, and it helped a new generation of directors to establish themselves. I think what's most difficult now is trying to bring up the next generation, like after Bong Joon-ho, because people working on their first films right now don't have the same amount of creative freedom as he did. And because the filmmaking process involves more compromise, the works that they produce, if they're working on a decent-sized budget, feel less original, and people tend not to remember you if your films aren't as original. So many directors are going towards focusing on independent, low-budget features. I mean, that's another thing that has emerged in the past 10 years as a really big, separate, independent film sector. But I think the challenge of continuing this, keeping up this level of creativity is sort of at the forefront of today's situation. And it really depends for each director on how much power they have. So Bong Joon-ho can do anything that he wants, and the result are films like Parasite. But if you don't have a track record behind you and you don't have that power, then it's more difficult to get the creative freedom that you need to make really groundbreaking work. So if we think about who are the most famous Korean directors these days, there are names like Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook, Kim Ji-yoon, Lee Chang-dong, Hong Sang-soo. Actually, all of them made their debut around the same time. It was between 1996 and 2000. And I do think that was kind of a golden period of opportunity for young filmmakers to establish themselves, because they were in an environment where it was easier to try new things. And it was after the industry became quite successful that the system became more developed, and there were good aspects to that, but the downside to that was it became more difficult for brand new directors to get that creative freedom. And we still do see examples of young directors who become commercially successful or who achieve some recognition on the film festival circuit. And so it's not impossible, I think, for a young filmmaker today to start along a similar kind of path as Bong Joon-ho, but I think it will take perhaps much longer, and certainly the hurdles will be higher than they were for this previous generation of filmmakers. The past 20 years have been a time of tremendous growth and development for Korean cinema. I think it's entered a more mature phase, and so I don't expect there to be as much growth. I'm not predicting like a big crash or anything else like that. I think it will remain fairly stable. It's ordinary viewers that I think are these days, partly because of Netflix and partly because of the success of Parasite or the gains made by Korean pop culture as a whole. I think ordinary viewers are in the process of discovering Korean films right now. Yeah, and they do seem to feel something different in Korean films. So that gives me a sense that the audience is going to continue to grow in the coming years. Like within the industry, I think people know Korea well at this point, but people, kind of average viewers, I think are still kind of at the early stages of discovering Korean film. One thing that's really interesting to compare between the film industry and the TV drama industry in Korea are the place of writers. On TV, like within the TV drama industry, you have writers who are quite famous and who even have fan followings. Whereas in the film industry, there's kind of an expectation put on directors that in most cases they should be writing their own scripts. Maybe working with another screenwriter, but there is kind of an auteur atmosphere within the film industry. And certainly if you're making your debut film, there are very few cases of a director who is able to direct their first film with somebody else's screenplay. Typically you need your own screenplay to do that. But I would hope that in the future, screenwriters are kind of encouraged and developed as a talent that's separate from directing. Because screenwriting and directing are two very different skills, and sometimes you find people who can do both, but I think we need more people who really specialize in screenwriting, and I think their status within the film industry needs to rise. The amount of pay they receive needs to rise. Because right now we have a situation where if you have a lot of talent as a writer, it makes much more sense to go into the TV industry because you'll get much better paid, you'll get more recognition. And there's a lot less of that in the Korean film industry. I think there are regional differences. So if we look at viewers in Europe and the US, there are certain genres that are easier to market than others. So thrillers, I think especially, have been the genre where Korean cinema has kind of made a name for itself. And there have been successful examples of thrillers that have reached a fairly big audience, just because I think fans of the genre are willing to take a chance on a film, regardless of which country it comes from. Within the Asian region, I think the way the Korean films are marketed are much more focused on the actors, and there's more of an interest in kind of romance and drama. I think it is slowly breaking down because, a lot of people used to say that, Americans don't read subtitles because as they're watching the film, it's either distracting or kind of tiring to have to read, text as you're watching the film. And I never really believed that because people consume text all day long on their phones. Just kind of a sense that foreign films or films in a foreign language were boring, or that they were kind of difficult to understand, or it was this image problem more for subtitled films. And so I'm hoping that movies like Parasite or films that people watch on Netflix can break that preconception that subtitled films are somehow less entertaining or less fun than Hollywood films. Because as someone who watches a lot of both commercial and kind of art house films from all around the world, there's so many really fun, entertaining, and really accessible films that are made in other languages. And so when people get over that barrier, and I think it's a mental barrier, then I think they will discover films that they really like from other countries. An intensity to Korean films and the approach to storytelling, I would kind of issue a challenge, I think, to people who are experiencing Korean cinema for the first time to try to get a sense of what it is about Korean films that feels different from Hollywood films or from other films they may be familiar with. Just because the storytelling, the approach to character, it's not radically different, but I think it's different enough that it distinguishes the feeling of Korean films from others. Certainly when I first started watching Korean films, that was something that caught my attention, and I hope that people who are encountering Korean films for the first time can think about that. Like, what is different about them? What makes them feel